There's no evidence that these civilizations are a threat. The threat is the national security state deceiving us. This is the same bunch of people who have been scamming the US government and the American public and the media for decades. I am very concerned that in our society, the compliance and the conformity and the sort of groveling before state power is very dangerous. It's not like we don't have a brain or mind and the ETs aren't watching. Why do we need this intermediary of a bunch of sociopathic, craven, power-hungry politicians and government bureaucrats to validate something we all know is true already? The Army Intelligence Director and others threatened me with. They said, you have no clearance to be doing this. I said, I don't need your permission. So this is what we have to be very, very careful of going forward in terms of disclosure and making contact, is that our motto is, if you can see it, one universe, one people. The foundation of our relationship with each other and these cosmic beings is this field of consciousness that we'll get into in a moment. But I knew that it would be sort of a difficult thing to do because we have a couple of controversial paradigms. One is that we're not alone in the universe, which shouldn't be controversial, but because of ridicule and secrecy, it has been. And the other is having people who have been miseducated about the nature of themselves and of consciousness and their own mind and their own empowerment, that there had to be an outreach to understanding something beyond the linear reductionist scientific paradigm. Not that that would be put aside, but that we would add to it this concept of other dimensions, higher states of consciousness, the nature of the mind as something not limited to space and time. Dr. Russell Targ and I last week had a great discussion about that for about an hour and a half. And I think that it has been a very long road, but what's really exciting for me is to see people I have never known personally. Like there's a woman who is a very big pop singer, apparently named, my kids would say I'm really lame, Demi Lovato.
You said it right. You said Demi Lovato right.
Okay, good. So a shout out to Demi, because she did this great interview on Stevio, and then she tweeted out to 36 million people about how she really loved Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. I want to reach out to her and tell her she needs to get the app, the CE5 Contact app, because the movie introduces you to these concepts. The app is actually a full-on remote viewing training program, CE5 training program. It has a networking function, so you can see who is in your geographical area and make contact with them to form a group, even if it's a virtual group at this stage or a small group. And by the way, you know, if a state allows 5 people or 10 people to get together, you can make a circle 6 feet apart. You can still social distance and get together and do this. So I think that, you know, what I'm finding is that there are a lot of folks following this, like Jenny McCarthy and the Wahlberg, her husband, Donnie Wahlberg. I was on their show, and I had no idea they were interested in this. And what's really exciting is to see that on every level of society, people are getting interested. I mean, even Fox News had me on last week on the Laura Ingraham show.
I saw
that. It was a very conservative show, and it was sort of shocking. But in fact, I found that, you know, a lot of people were saying, oh my God, how could you be on that network? I said, to me, this subject transcends all those normal fracture lines of left, right, conservative, all the labels, because we're dealing with something that is interplanetary and cosmic. And I really don't see this breaking along the usual fractured lines of our society of all these tribalistic fighting factions. I see this as something that is inherently unifying, that transcends that cacophony of conflict. You know, let me exciting. I think that's the part of this that, as someone who's sort of in the center of this, you know, where I'm getting contacted by every kind of person. Like there's a great rock band, if you like heavy metal, called Godsmack. Well, the lead guy, Sully Erna, has reached out to me, and he put out a tweet and saw the movie and is really excited. So there are all kinds of, and there's a band called Tool, I don't know
Yeah.
if
Oh,
you-
yeah.
Yeah, so they're really into this. I was with them backstage, when they were in this area not long ago. But what I'm finding is that there are people from all walks of life, whether it's left, right, politicians, scientists, pop culture folks, who are realizing that this is the future of our civilization, is to become interplanetary, but also that the foundation for that is understanding a deep aspect of our spirituality that transcends the normal tribalism that humans break into.
Yeah,
And
and
so,
what I wanted to mention before we get out of time, run out of time, is the elephant in the room, which was last week. The Navy and the Pentagon officially, with quotes, released these 3 videos, and the media shows no signs of letting up and covering ET, UAP / UFO coverage, and that's the exciting part. But the other side of it is, especially with everything that's happening with Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind right now, the response from the world seemed to be more muted than some of the breaking news that we've had over the last 2 years on this subject. Did that surprise you?
No, because we're in the middle of a global pandemic that has collapsed our economic system, where we're heading into something that will be worse than the Great Depression if we're not careful. So I think, in that milieu, with that going on, it's very difficult for people to focus in any real depth in terms of the mainstream media on something like this, because unfortunately the reporting on this subject always stops at the superficial. In other words, here's something that these pilots were chasing, and here's the footage, and it's something, quote, we don't understand. It never, if you look at mainstream media, it never goes any deeper than that. For example, what are they? Where have they come from? I quickly held up on Fox News this letter from Ben Rich, who is the head of the Lockheed Skunk Works, the super secret aerospace contracting outfit there up in the desert of California. And it was a letter from Ben Rich stating very specifically that there were 2 types of UFOs: ours, meaning man-made electromagnetic anti-grav devices, and ET. And he states this in his own handwriting. All right.
What was the response from Fox?
Oh, well, it was a very short, big network things are, 2, 3, 4 minutes. So, I mean, I basically all that was said is, wow, there's a lot to unpack here. But the issue is, one of my point is making is that the issue never goes beyond that, except that in the case of the Pentagon footage, it reopened the door. And this is what it was really about.
Right.
Just as this documentary that exposes the false flag alien threat narrative, which is in the opening first chapter of Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, if you've seen the movie, they re-release this footage, but it gives the opportunity for the disinformation specialist, if you looked at the coverage and read it all the way through, at the very end of every story was, it's a threat to our national security. Right. It's a threat to our airspace. Again, it was an opportunity for them to subliminally reinforce this threat narrative, which has been the purpose of the release of that footage since late 2017, in December 2017. So that was always the agenda. We knew that. I mean, I immediately got an email from a very senior CIA person who's worked the UFO subject for decades and said, this is the same bunch of people who have been scamming the US government and the American public and the media for decades. I'm quoting. And we knew that right away. And that was because Unacknowledged, which had gone over onto various platforms and eventually got over 600 million viewers, was so trending that they wanted a countermeasure to tamp down that narrative.
Right.
Now, just as this documentary is trending and it's #1 all over the world, in fact, amongst all movies, including $100 million, $200 million feature films, it's in the top 30, which is unheard of for a crowdfunded indie documentary. So, surprise, they re-release this footage, which gives the opportunity for the spin masters of disinformation to attach the threat narrative to it, which is, of course, the opposite of the narrative and message that we're putting out. Right. And that is that there's no evidence that these civilizations are a threat. The threat is the national security state deceiving us that there is one, basically hoaxing the threat. So I don't, when people said, are you surprised that this came out again? I said, no, I'm expecting this sort of thing. This is what counterintelligence always tries to neutralize any sort of movement away from the narrative of disinformation that they specialize in. And so the Pentagon officially, I can tell you that when this came out in December of 2017, that was an official release.
That's right.
It was just through a cutout group, an organization that was chock full of CIA and Pentagon and Lockheed people who made it look like they got their hands on it and were able to release it. And then they attached this alien threat narrative. In reality, that was always part of the covert program. It's just being reinforced where they can milk that story again by re-releasing it last week with the narrative again that it's a threat to our airspace, a threat to our armed forces, a threat. Why do they need a threat? Because they need to prop up the warmongers and the big folks out there who are making trillions of dollars on the status quo of world conflict and how the world is operating, which is on a tribalistic war footing. We always have to find someone to be killing and hate. Who's the new people to hate?
You have to have it. Yeah.
They have to create a new enemy, right?
Right.
I mean, that's what all propagandists who are in governments know, is that in order to maintain their power through fear, they have to manifest a new enemy. So I think that this isn't surprising that this would happen. And I'm predicting that this will be more of these things will happen.
I find it interesting that they've actually officially released these now 3 times. Right? Yes. If you think about it, you and I talked about it in December 2017. We talked about the UAP coverage last year extensively. That was another official acknowledgement coming out of the Navy and the Pentagon. And then now, very interestingly, they've released it a 3rd time with the fear narrative, when the fear pummeling of the public has been going on for 2 or 3 months now in mass media. And it's an opportunity. And it's also timed with the release of Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind.
Right. And I think, the problem is that, a lot of things are real that are things we should be concerned about. For example, elderly and people who have underlying conditions are really threatened by this current crisis. But it's interesting, if you look at the statistics from a couple years ago, influenza killed 172 children. The last I checked on the CDC site, this particular crisis, there have been 3. So it's 1/50th and yet we have this situation where if you were to go to the public, the impression is that younger people and children are dropping dead like flies, but they're not. So I think that one of the concerns I always have is that a crisis becomes an opportunity for people who would like to take away our liberties and our freedoms. And they can create something that's a legitimate crisis. I'm not saying it's not. And then capitalize on it. So this is what we have to be very, very careful of going forward in terms of disclosure and making contact, is that there are folks who are going to try to spin any situation to their fascist police state agendas. And this is why we have to be ever vigilant for our freedoms and our liberty, because there are folks who will try to capitalize on that if we're not awake.
Do you feel that the public, when I say public, I mean the earth, especially today, is now finally becoming aware of that message that we've been talking about for so many years, which is fear is a way of control? Now they've seen it 24 hours a day for months on end now. Are you and I vindicated somewhat, and the rest of us that have been speaking about this for so long?
Yes, but I think the thing that is worrying me the most, and I want to be careful what I'm saying here so I don't get erased here.
Right.
If you get my drift, folks,
I
who are
do.
listening,
Oh, yes.
and that is when I see National Guard troops outside a neighborhood Safeway in Washington, D.C., along with police force, for people going to get their bread and orange juice and food for the day. And no one is going, what the hell is going on here? In other words, and I know I'm dating myself, but those of us who are the 60s, 70s generation, this kind of police state tactic over something that's a healthcare issue and there's no civil unrest going on, there would have been massive, enormous pushback from the population for the overreach of police state tactics. Right now, everyone's going, oh, they're so obsequious and obedient and conformist. They're going, oh, okay, because they have everyone cowered. They have everyone terrified. And I think that this actually does concern me. I'm going to be very blunt here. I am very concerned that in our society, the compliance and the conformity and the sort of groveling before state power is very dangerous. It's necessary when it's necessary to obey rules and laws. I'm not saying I'm not an anarchist at all, but I'm saying when those powers get abused and there is widespread unthinking, unquestioning compliance, we're in trouble. We have really got to step back and go, oh, wait a minute here. And there's a lot of misinformation going out. So in the same way, what you see with disclosure is you will have people where something will begin to happen, and then the momentum will be hijacked by people who spin it in the direction of fear, hatred of all things alien, et cetera, and so on. And I think that an awake populace, what Eisenhower said, the populace needs to be awake to the threats to our democracy and our security by the excesses of the military-industrial complex. And Eisenhower said that because he had been betrayed by those same people on the UFO ET issue. We know this for a fact. So we have to look at how our response to a crisis is it appropriate? Is it measured? Are we letting authorities who always get drunk with power abuse that power? Or are we putting them in check? Now, this is very important in the UFO subject because it is so ripe for abuse in terms of scaring people. Because, let's face it, generally people are afraid of the unknown. And the word alien means foreign, although I don't use that term because it's non-specific. When you say alien, do you mean someone from Guatemala? Or do you
another country,
another country, or another dimension? That's not ET, but it's from another dimension and not extraterrestrial. I never used the term alien for that reason, those of you listening, because I think words mean something. And so I used the word ET, or extraterrestrial biological life form, or something to that effect, to be specific. But I think that what we're seeing, and by the way, it's Cinco de Mayo, a happy Cinco de Mayo to everyone. I think we should honor the cultures of the native peoples of America, Latin America, South America, because in their culture, the star people and the brothers and sisters from the stars, even right here, I'm looking at Shenandoah National Park. Shenandoah is believed to be derived from a Native American word that means sister from the stars, or sister of the stars.
Right.
So, and I'm part Cherokee. My dad was half Cherokee Native American. So I kind of look at this and I go, there are a lot of people around the world that really do understand the idea that we're not alone in the universe, and that that's a normal part of understanding. But what the military industrial complex realized between the 40s and the late 50s is that they could really make hay out of, as I'm quoting from a CIA document that said, where they can use the psychological warfare value of UFOs. I'm quoting from a CIA document, officially released, by the way, on this issue. And that's what's happened for 70 years, is that it's been taken and spun into this direction by people who obviously have an agenda that isn't about peace and exploration of space peacefully. Their agenda is trying to create the next boogeyman that everyone should be terrified about. And so when the Pentagon released those videos again, re-released it, I'm not saying released, I'm saying re-released.
3 times.
Yes, 3 times. Then I knew that there was going to be this entire attached narrative, which actually happened. And the anecdote for that kind of disinformation, quite honestly, is Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. People understanding that there is the reason and I haven't said this to you yet, the reason the director and I put that first chapter in there, which doesn't have anything per se to do with contact and consciousness and the CE5 protocols, but we used up the first 20 some minutes of that film to try to use a contemporary term, inoculate the population from the fear-based disinformation narrative of there being a threat from outer space. That we felt that we had to put that in there because most of the public have already been brainwashed that this is a threat. And if you really think it's a threat, you're not going to go sit out in your backyard or in a state park doing CE5 protocols and inviting to make contact, because you've already been convinced these are scary beings that you should be afraid of.
Right.
So this, I call it the contagion, the viral contagion of fear, is what these spinmeisters at the CIA and Pentagon and counterintelligence are expert at. And we've got to be awake to the fact that we need to counter that disinformation and manipulation, because that's how you get into a disaster like the Iraq War. That's how you get after 9/11. That's how you get into a disaster like Vietnam. That's how you get civilizational collapse over something like that's happening right now. If we overextend our response to it, that is how you get into an interplanetary conflict or an interplanetary war. So, these are huge stakes here we're talking about. And that's why I think we need people who are going to be telling people the truth and not get sucked into this contagion of fear. Because I think what we really have to fear is fear itself. But I think more importantly, being manipulated into having a compliant, conformist acceptance of what the authority figures are telling us. So if the authority figures who are attached to the government, to the Pentagon, even scientific entities say, oh yes, those are real objects we were chasing, but they're a threat to our armed forces. They're a threat to our national security. And people believe that in this sort of Pavlovian response, this automatic response that you're seeing now with this current crisis, without anyone questioning what's actually going on. I think we could be in real trouble down the road. And this is why I think this is a big wake-up call. And the timing of it is strange, that we're releasing this huge movement and expanding the CE5 Global Peace Initiative, which is what it is. It's a interplanetary peace initiative is what we're doing. And we go into lockdown, and then we have the re-release of this footage with that narrative. It's all very strange. You could call it a series of coincidences, but knowing what I know, having met with a lot of people at the CIA and Pentagon, I think it'd be a little too convenient by twice that it's an actual coincidence.
With so many out there that want disclosure and need disclosure, I mean, let's face it, disclosure and our community, the people that are with us, Dr. Greer, are here for emotional reasons, personal reasons. Mm-hmm. There are things that bring them here. And for them, for their own resolve in their minds, mm-hmm. the only form of disclosure for them is a head of state like the president on live television, right? And but it's probably never going to happen that way. We know this. So how do we start to affect the change? What's the best approach?
We do the disclosure. That's what the reason I did the disclosure project is that I had already met with White House folks and the CIA director and top people in the Senate Intelligence Committee personally, face to face, in extensive meetings. And it was made very clear to me that those people, almost to a fault, were not read into or had access to those projects. When they inquired, as you know, Admiral Wilson had this happen, or denied access, or were threatened if they pushed too hard. And that if they did find out, like Ronald Reagan did, President Reagan, they're surrounded by a bubble of people who come in and tell them that this is a national security threat. So, for example, people went up on Capitol Hill after the initial release of that footage from the Pentagon in 2017, and there were closed door briefings that I have personal knowledge of members of that same team and cabal of disinformation specialists who were briefing members of the Senate and House intelligence and armed services, telling them the most terrifying things about UFOs. I know that happened for a personal fact. So what I'm saying is, this is why we have to be ever vigilant, but ultimately disclosure consists of we, the people, bypassing that circus and making contact. And I said this back in the early 90s, the ultimate, first of all, seeing is believing. So if you look at Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, there's just dozens and dozens and dozens of photos and videos of amazing CE5 contact events. Well, those, many of those, I wasn't even there. It was people who had practiced the protocols, understood how they worked, went out and gave it a whirl, and it happened. So I'm telling people that if you have millions and millions of people do that, who needs the CIA and the Pentagon or the president to disclose something? It's not like we don't have a brain or mind and the ETs aren't watching. Why do we need this intermediary of a bunch of sociopathic, craven, power-hungry politicians and government bureaucrats to validate something we all know is true already? Why don't we go and validate it ourselves? See, that's always been my argument, because the definition of a close encounter of the fifth kind is a human initiated and cooperative contact event, point to point, us to the visitors. And it isn't where we have to run it through the national security state. And in fact, that was the very first thing that the Army Intelligence Director and others threatened me with. They said, you have no clearance to be doing this. I said, I don't need your permission. You can go pound salt. I mean, you know how I am. I'm nice until I'm not nice. Right. And then it's hell on wheels. But what I'm saying is that I just said, I don't recognize your authority. I said that right to the face of the head of Army Intelligence and his CIA and NSA minions. And this was in 92. And after the thing happened in Florida, where we had these 4 craft appear, and it got in the newspaper, and the intelligence community went ballistic. They were very upset. So what I've said for almost 30 years to these folks is, you have your agenda. We need to have the people create their own agenda. What is the people's agenda? Do we all benefit from being scared out of our minds and going to interplanetary war? Or do we benefit from disclosure, direct contact, and coming together also? And let me just throw this in here. The third pillar, the part of this triangle, is the release of the technologies that would give us a new civilization with no poverty or pollution.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out the next one right here on the Best of Dr. Stephen Greer.